Montana Territory, 1876. Sunlight spilled across the meadow like liquid gold, catching in the tall prairie grass that whispered secrets to the wind. For Vaughn Xander, 26 years of life on the frontier had taught him one undeniable truth: a man survived by keeping to himself. Survival required vigilance, not vulnerability. Love was a luxury that got men killed out here where the law stretched thin and danger rode with the wind. The cattle drive had been grueling, 3 weeks pushing stubborn longhorns north from Texas to the settlement of Willow Creek. Now, as Vaughn dismounted his dun gelding at the edge of town, his muscles ached with familiar weariness. He was trail-weary but satisfied, another job completed without complication, another season of solitude successfully navigated. "Think I'll grab some hot food before we head back to the ranch," said Elijah, the oldest hand among the trail crew. The grizzled cowhand slapped dust from his chaps. "You coming, Vaughn?" Vaughn shook his head. "Need to check in with the boss, make sure he's satisfied with the delivery." Truth was, he avoided the crowded saloons and boarding houses whenever possible. Vaughn had learned early that silence was safety. His father, before getting himself shot in a pointless saloon argument when Vaughn was 14, had been a man of endless words and empty promises. Vaughn had chosen a different path: speak little, observe much, stay alive. At 26, he'd grown into his frame, broad-shouldered and lean-muscled from years of ranch work. His face, shaded by his wide-brimmed hat, remained youthful despite the weathering of sun and wind. Unlike many cowboys, he kept himself clean-shaven when circumstances allowed, a habit his mother had instilled before consumption took her. The memory of her voice still echoed: "A gentleman does not hide behind whiskers, Vaughn." Crossing the dusty main street toward the mercantile where the cattle broker maintained an office, Vaughn's attention snagged on a figure standing on the boardwalk outside. A young woman, perhaps 20 or 21, stood clutching a small valise, looking uncertain. Her dress, though travel-worn, was of good quality, cornflower blue with white trim, fashionable but practical. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged neatly beneath a modest bonnet, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. What caught his attention, however, was the expression in her blue eyes, a mixture of determination and fear that seemed familiar. It was the look of someone trying to appear brave while feeling utterly lost. As he approached, the stagecoach thundered in behind him, kicking up dust and drawing attention. The woman flinched at the noise, her knuckles whitening around her valise. When the coach driver called out, "Last stop, Willow Creek," she seemed to grow even more tense. Vaughn would have continued past. Other people's troubles were not his concern, but something in her demeanor made him pause. She reminded him of a spooked colt, ready to bolt at the first sudden move. "Miss," he said, removing his hat. "Are you expecting someone to meet you?" Her eyes snapped to his, startled. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she shook her head slightly. "Pearl." Pearl Zachary, the mercantile owner, Harold Bishop, emerged from his store. "Is that you, girl? My word, look how you've grown. When your letter said you were coming, I hardly believed it." Relief flooded her features, though she still didn't speak. Instead, she nodded and extended her hand to Bishop. "Well now, don't just stand there. Come inside, come inside. Your aunt's been gone these 3 years, God rest her soul, but I've kept everything just as she left it in the rooms above the millinery, just like I promised in my reply." The shopkeeper continued chattering as he took her valise. "Hope the journey wasn't too difficult. Stagecoach is rough business, especially for a lady." Bishop finally seemed to notice Vaughn standing there. "Oh, Xander, the cattle delivery go smooth." "No trouble," Vaughn answered, placing his hat back on his head. "Mr. Porter inside?" Yes, yes, waiting on you. Go on in." Bishop turned his attention back to the young woman. "Miss Pearl here is taking over her aunt's millinery shop." "Come all the way from Philadelphia, haven't you, dear?" The woman Pearl nodded again, her eyes briefly meeting Vaughn's. Something in that look struck him, not just fear or uncertainty, but something deeper. Determination, perhaps, or desperation. It wasn't his business, Vaughn reminded himself. The frontier was filled with people running toward something or away from something else. Their stories weren't his concern. Survival meant focusing on his own path. He tipped his hat slightly and continued into the mercantile, leaving the shopkeeper and the silent young woman behind. He had payment to collect and then a long ride back to the Circle M ranch where he worked. No time for distractions, especially not one with honey blonde hair and troubled blue eyes. Pearl Zachary stood in her aunt's former living quarters above the millinery shop, running her fingers along the dust-coated surfaces. 3 years vacant, yet her aunt's presence lingered in the small collection of books, the faded quilt on the narrow bed, the porcelain figurines arranged on a shelf, objects that once meant something to someone who had mattered to Pearl. Aunt Martha had been her mother's younger sister, the adventurous one who had traveled west to make her own way when Pearl was just a child. Her occasional letters had painted a picture of freedom and possibility that had enchanted Pearl even then. But now, at 20 years old, Pearl wasn't here for adventure. She was here because she had nowhere else to go. She moved to the small window that overlooked the main street of Willow Creek. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty thoroughfare as townspeople went about their business. A woman in a practical calico dress herded two small children toward the general store. Two men in conversation paused to shake hands before parting ways. And there, the cowboy from earlier, emerging from the mercantile, tucking something into his pocket. Even from this distance, she could see the easy grace with which he moved, confident but not showy, like someone comfortable in his own skin. Unlike the men she'd known in Philadelphia, who seemed to perform their importance with every gesture. Pearl pressed her hand against the glass, cool beneath her fingertips. How would it feel to move through the world with such certainty, to know your place and purpose, to speak your mind without fear of the consequences? The thought caught in her throat, familiar and painful. 3 months since she'd last spoken a word aloud. 3 months since the day her voice had abandoned her, seized by a terror that clenched her vocal cords and refused to release them. The doctors in Philadelphia had called it hysterical aphonia, a condition of the nerves, they said, brought on by severe shock or emotional distress. It will pass, they assured her father, as if she weren't sitting right there. Women are prone to such nervous conditions. What they didn't understand was that silence had become her only defense. After what had happened with Judge Harrington, after her father's reaction, after the whispers and stares. Silence was safer than speech. Words had failed her when she needed them most, so why trust them now? Pearl turned away from the window as the cowboy mounted his horse and rode out of town. Her new life was waiting. Aunt Martha's shop needed cleaning, inventory needed assessment, and Pearl needed to prove to herself that she could survive here, 3,000 miles from everything familiar. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the small slate and chalk she now carried everywhere. On it she carefully wrote, "I am Pearl Zachary. I cannot speak, but I can hear. I am the new milliner." This would have to do. In Philadelphia, her silence had marked her as damaged, pitiable. Here, perhaps, it could simply be another fact about her, like her blonde hair or blue eyes. Perhaps here, in this frontier town where everyone seemed to be reinventing themselves, she could find a way to live with her silence rather than be defined by it. Vaughn didn't return to Willow Creek for nearly 3 weeks. The Circle M kept him busy, mending fences, breaking horses, and preparing for winter. Besides, town held little appeal for him. He preferred the rhythm of ranch work and the simplicity of days measured by sunrise and sunset. But when Porter, the ranch owner, needed supplies and paperwork delivered to the bank in town, Vaughn volunteered. He told himself it was simply to avoid another day of shoeing horses, but as he rode down the main street, his eyes drifted to the millinery shop. A new sign hung above the door. Zachary Millinery and Fine Goods. The windows had been washed and a display of women's hats arranged artfully behind the glass. Business seemed to be thriving. 2 women emerged, chatting happily, each carrying a wrapped package. Vaughn completed his errands efficiently, as was his habit. Banking business concluded, supplies purchased and loaded, but instead of heading immediately back to the ranch, he found himself pausing outside the millinery shop. Through the window, he could see Pearl Zachary assisting an older woman with a hat. Her movements were graceful and confident as she adjusted the angle of the hat on the customer's head, then nodded approvingly. She was writing something on her slate which she showed to the woman, who laughed in response. Pearl looked different than she had 3 weeks ago. The fear in her eyes had receded, replaced by calm purpose. Her honey blonde hair was styled more practically now, partially pinned up with a few soft curls framing her face. Her dress was simple but becoming pale green that complemented her fair complexion. Vaughn realized he was staring and stepped back from the window, chiding himself. The woman's business was her own, not his concern, yet something about her silent determination intrigued him. He'd heard gossip at the general store that she was mute from birth, that she'd lost her voice in some tragic accident, that she was actually a wealthy Easterner hiding from scandal. Frontier towns thrived on such speculation. The bell above the door chimed as the customer exited. The woman noticed Vaughn and smiled knowingly. "Beautiful work she does," she said, patting the hatbox under her arm. "That girl may not speak, but her hands surely do talk through her creations." Vaughn merely nodded. When the woman had gone, he found himself pushing open the door before he'd fully decided to enter. The shop was neat and welcoming, with shelves displaying not just hats but ribbons, gloves, and other accessories. Pearl emerged from the back room at the sound of the bell, a polite smile ready on her lips. When she saw Vaughn, surprise flickered across her face, followed by recognition. "Miss Zachary," he said, removing his hat. "I'm not sure if you remember me, Vaughn Xander from the Circle M Ranch." She nodded, then reached for her slate. Quickly she wrote, "The Cowboy from my first day. How may I help you?" Her handwriting was neat and precise, he noticed, educated. "I don't need anything," he admitted, "just wanted to see how you were settling in." Pearl tilted her head slightly, studying him with curious eyes. After a moment she erased her slate and wrote again, "Very well, thank you. Willow Creek has been kind to me." "That's good." Vaughn felt suddenly awkward, aware of how unusual it was for him to engage in social calls. Town can use a good milliner. Ladies were having to order from catalogs or travel to Helena before. She smiled at this, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. She wrote, "Are you shopping for a lady friend, Mr. Xander?" "No, ma'am," he answered quickly. "No lady friend." This seemed to amuse her. She wrote, "A man like you must have many admirers." Vaughn felt a warmth creep up his neck. Ranch work doesn't leave much time for socializing. He adjusted his hat in his hands. "I should probably be getting back, just wanted to make sure you were all right." Pearl's expression softened. She wrote, "That's very kind. I am managing quite well." Vaughn nodded, uncertain what else to say. As he turned to leave, she touched his arm lightly. When he looked back, she was writing again, "The Mercantile is hosting a harvest social this Saturday. Will you attend?" The question surprised him. Vaughn generally avoided town gatherings, too much noise, too many people expecting conversation, but looking at Pearl's expectant face, he found himself nodding. "Might be able to make it," he said, "if work allows." She smiled again and wrote, "I hope to see you there." Outside, mounting his horse, Vaughn wondered what had possessed him to agree to a social. He'd spent years cultivating his reputation for keeping to himself. The cowboys at the ranch jokingly called him the ghost for his habit of appearing exactly when needed and vanishing when the work was done. Yet something about Pearl Zachary's silent courage made him want to step beyond the boundaries he'd built for himself. Perhaps it was the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else navigating the world on different terms than most. Riding back to the Circle M, Vaughn told himself he probably wouldn't attend the harvest social anyway. Porter would likely need hands at the ranch, and even if he didn't, town gatherings were a waste of time. But as the week progressed, Vaughn found himself checking the condition of his good shirt and wondering if he should get a proper haircut before Saturday. The harvest social transformed the Mercantile into a gathering place. Tables had been pushed to the walls, laden with food brought by townsfolk. A fiddle player and a man with a banjo provided music in one corner, while lanterns cast a warm glow over the proceedings. Nearly everyone from Willow Creek and the surrounding ranches had turned out, creating a cheerful din of conversation and laughter. Vaughn arrived later than most, having spent extra time washing up and changing into his one good shirt after finishing his ranch duties. He stood at the entrance, hat in hand, scanning the crowd. The noise and press of bodies made him instantly regret his decision to come. Then he saw her. Pearl stood near the refreshment table, dressed in a lovely blue gown that complemented her eyes. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than usual, with small white flowers woven into the golden strands. She was listening to Mrs. Bishop, the mercantile owner's wife, and smiling politely. As if sensing his gaze, Pearl looked up. When she spotted Vaughn, her smile transformed from polite to genuinely pleased. She excused herself from Mrs. Bishop and made her way through the crowd toward him. Miss Zachary, Vaughn greeted her, suddenly conscious of his rough hands and the way his good shirt, rarely worn, felt stiff and unnatural. Pearl reached into the small reticule hanging from her wrist and produced her slate. She wrote quickly, "You came, I'm glad." "Said I would," he replied simply. She wrote again, "Would you like some punch?" He nodded, grateful for the sense of purpose. They made their way to the refreshment table, where Pearl poured 2 cups of punch and handed one to him. The simple interaction felt strangely comfortable, her silence creating a pocket of calm in the bustling room. "You look nice," Vaughn said after taking a sip. "Blue suits you." Pearl's cheeks colored slightly. She wrote, "Thank you, you look very handsome yourself." Before he could respond, Elijah from the Circle M appeared, clapping Vaughn on the shoulder. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Didn't expect to see you here, Vaughn. You usually avoid these gatherings like they're carrying cholera." Vaughn shrugged, "Thought I'd make an appearance." Elijah's gaze moved to Pearl, and understanding dawned on his weathered face. "Ah, I see the attraction now. Miss Zachary, isn't it? I've heard about your fine work. My wife admired your window display just yesterday." Pearl nodded politely. "Well, don't let me interrupt," Elijah said with a knowing smile. "Just surprised to see our resident ghost materializing for a social event. Enjoy your evening." He winked at Vaughn before disappearing back into the crowd. Pearl raised an eyebrow questioningly and wrote, "Ghost." "Just a nickname," Vaughn explained, feeling self-conscious. "I tend to keep to myself." She studied him for a moment, then wrote, "Yet here you are." "Here I am," he agreed. The music shifted to a waltz and several couples moved to the center of the room to dance. Pearl watched them, a wistful expression crossing her face. Before he could think better of it, Vaughn asked, "Would you like to dance, Miss Zachary?" Surprise flashed in her eyes. She hesitated, then wrote, "I would love to, but I'm afraid I have not danced in a very long time." "That's all right," he said. "I'm not much of a dancer myself. We can be awkward together." This earned him a smile. She slipped her slate into her reticule and placed her hand in his. Her fingers were slender but strong, a working woman's hands despite their elegance. Vaughn led her to the edge of the dancing area. He'd learned the basics of dancing years ago before his father died, when his mother insisted he would need such skills to be a gentleman. Those lessons were rusty now, but he remembered enough to place one hand at Pearl's waist and hold her other hand properly. "Just follow my lead," he said quietly. "Nothing fancy." Pearl nodded and they began to move with the music. At first their steps were hesitant, slightly mismatched, but gradually they found a rhythm together. Pearl was a quick learner, anticipating his movements, matching his pace. As they danced, Vaughn became acutely aware of her presence. The light scent of lavender that clung to her hair, the warmth of her hand in his, the trust in her eyes as she followed his lead. It had been years since he'd been this close to anyone, and the intimacy of it was both unsettling and exhilarating. "You're doing fine," he assured her as they completed a turn. "Better than fine." Pearl's smile was radiant. In that moment, Vaughn understood why he'd come to the social despite his reservations. There was something about this silent woman that drew him, her courage, her dignity, the eloquence of her expressions that needed no words. When the music ended, they remained standing close for a moment longer than necessary. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits finding each other in an unlikely place. The evening continued with more dancing, refreshments, and conversation. Pearl introduced Vaughn to several townspeople, facilitating interactions with her slate. He found himself talking more than he had in months, somehow made more comfortable by her silent presence. Later, as the social began to wind down, Vaughn offered to walk Pearl home. The October night was cool, stars brilliant above the small frontier town. They strolled in companionable silence until they reached the millinery shop. At her door, Pearl wrote on her slate, "Thank you for a lovely evening." "My pleasure," Vaughn replied. "It was nice to be social for a change." She smiled at this, then hesitated before writing again. "I close the shop on Sundays. Perhaps you would like to join me for a picnic tomorrow." "If you don't have ranch duties." The invitation surprised and pleased him. "I'd like that," he said. "Porter gives us Sunday afternoons off unless there's an emergency." Pearl's expression brightened. She wrote, "I'll pack a basket. Meet me here at noon." "I'll be here," Vaughn promised. As he walked back to where his horse was hitched, Vaughn felt lighter than he had in years. The silent milliner was awakening something in him he'd thought long buried, a desire for connection, for something beyond mere survival. It was dangerous, he knew. Caring made you vulnerable. Vulnerability got you hurt. But for the first time in a long while, Vaughn was willing to risk it. The Sunday afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the cottonwood leaves along the creek bank where Pearl had spread a quilt for their picnic. The location was perfect, close enough to town for propriety's sake, but far enough for privacy. The gentle sound of the creek provided a soothing backdrop as they shared the meal she had prepared. "This is delicious," Vaughn said, sampling a slice of apple pie. "Did you make it?" Pearl nodded, looking pleased. She wrote on her slate, "My mother taught me to bake before I could read." "She taught you well," he replied. "My mother was a good cook too, made the best biscuits I've ever tasted." The memory was bittersweet. His mother's kitchen had been the warmest place in his childhood before illness claimed her. Pearl seemed to sense the change in his mood. She wrote, "Tell me about your family." Vaughn rarely spoke about his past, but something about Pearl's gentle curiosity made it easier. "Not much to tell. Father was a dreamer, always chasing the next opportunity, never staying in one place long. Mother was the steady one, kept us together. Lost her to consumption when I was 12, lost him to a bullet in a saloon argument 2 years later." Pearl's expression softened with sympathy. She reached out and briefly touched his hand, a gesture so simple yet profound in its comfort. "Been on my own since then," he continued. "Worked ranches across 3 territories before settling at the Circle M 5 years ago." She wrote, "It must have been very hard, losing them both so young." "It was," he admitted. "Learned quick that depending on others is a risk. Frontier doesn't forgive weakness." Pearl studied him for a moment, then wrote, "Is that why they call you the ghost?" "Because you keep your distance." Vaughn nodded, "Safer that way." She considered this, then wrote, "Yet you are here with me." The simple observation caught him off guard. "Yes," he acknowledged, "I am." She wrote again. "Why?" It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself. "Don't rightly know," he answered honestly. "Something about you makes me want to be less of a ghost, I suppose." Pearl's cheeks colored slightly. She tucked a strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear before writing, "I have been a ghost too, in my way." "Because you don't speak?" he asked gently. She nodded, then hesitated before writing, "I could speak once. Until 3 months ago." This surprised him. "What happened?" he asked, then quickly added, "If you don't mind telling me." Pearl stared at her slate for a long moment before erasing it clean and writing, "There was a man in Philadelphia. A judge, powerful and respected. My father worked as his clerk." She paused, seemingly gathering courage, then continued, "He took an interest in me, made advances. When I refused him, he became angry. Told my father I had led him on, that I was the one who had acted inappropriately." Vaughn felt a cold anger building inside him, "And your father believed him." Pearl's hand trembled slightly as she wrote, "The judge was his employer, his path to advancement. It was easier to believe I was at fault." "That's wrong," Vaughn said, his voice low and intense. "No father should choose ambition over his daughter's word." Pearl's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She wrote, "The day my father told me I would apologize to the judge, explain my misunderstanding of his intentions, that was the day my voice disappeared. I tried to protest, to explain again what had really happened, but no sound would come. It hasn't returned since. The doctors called it hysteria," she added, "but it wasn't hysteria, it was betrayal. When the person who should have protected me chose not to believe me, words failed me. What use are they if they aren't heard?" Vaughn reached out and gently took the slate from her hands, setting it aside. Then he took her hands in his. "I believe you," he said simply, but with absolute conviction. A tear spilled down Pearl's cheek. She squeezed his hands in silent gratitude. "Is that why you came west?" he asked. "To get away from him, from your father?" She nodded, then retrieved her slate to write. "After 3 months of silent shame, my father arranged for me to come here. Said Aunt Martha's shop needed tending, but really I had become an embarrassment, a constant reminder of his choice." "His loss," Vaughn said firmly. "Willow Creek's gain." Pearl smiled through her tears. She wrote, Thank you for listening, for believing. Always, he promised. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared confidences creating a new intimacy between them. The afternoon sun warmed them as the creek bubbled nearby. Finally, Pearl wrote, "Now you know my secret. I've shown you my ghost." "And I'm glad you did," Vaughn replied. He hesitated, then added, "Maybe someday your voice will return. But even if it doesn't, you communicate just fine. Better than most who waste words without saying anything worth hearing." Her smile was like sunrise after a long night. She wrote, "You are a surprise, Vaughn Xander. A cowboy poet." He chuckled, "Hardly that, just speaking truth as I see it." As they packed up their picnic later, Vaughn realized something had shifted between them. Trust had been extended and accepted. Vulnerabilities revealed and respected. The careful distance he maintained from others had narrowed, allowing Pearl into spaces he'd kept guarded for years. It was terrifying and wonderful. The weeks that followed brought an Indian summer to Montana territory, unusually warm and pleasant for late October. Vaughn found reasons to ride into Willow Creek more frequently, delivering messages, picking up supplies, checking on ranch business. Each visit included a stop at the millinery shop, where Pearl would greet him with a brightening expression that made his heart beat faster. Sometimes their encounters were brief, just a few minutes of conversation via her slate while she worked. Other times, when business was slow, they would walk together through town or sit on the bench outside her shop, sharing observations and gradually revealing more of themselves to each other. Pearl wrote about Philadelphia, about her childhood, about the aunt whose shop she had inherited. Vaughn told her about the ranch, about breaking horses, about the vastness of the Montana sky that had always felt like home to him. Small confidences building a bridge between their separate worlds. On Sundays, they established a ritual of picnics by the creek when weather permitted. As they grew more comfortable with each other, Vaughn found himself talking more than he had in years. Pearl was an attentive listener, her expressions and quick notes on her slate encouraging him to continue when he might have fallen back into silence. One particularly warm Sunday in early November, they sat beneath a golden cottonwood, the last of its leaves clinging stubbornly to the branches. "Winter's coming," Vaughn observed, looking at the mountains to the west where snow already capped the highest peaks. "Won't be many more days like this." Pearl wrote, "I've never experienced a Montana winter. People say it's quite severe." "Can be," he acknowledged, "but it's beautiful too, in its way. Everything clean and white, the air so clear you can see forever." She wrote, "It sounds lovely but also intimidating. The millinery shop gets very cold, even with the stove." Vaughn frowned. "Your living quarters above the shop, are they well insulated? Many of these older buildings weren't built with proper winter protection." Pearl hesitated before writing, "It's drafty. I've been patching what I can, but—" "I could help," he offered immediately. "Check the walls, the windows, make sure you're properly prepared before the real cold sets in." Her expression brightened. She wrote, "Would you? I would be so grateful. And I could pay you for your trouble." "No need for payment," he said. "That's what friends do for each other." The word friends felt insufficient, but Vaughn wasn't sure what other word might better describe what they were becoming to each other. More than acquaintances, certainly, but he didn't dare presume anything more intimate, despite the growing warmth he felt whenever she was near. Pearl studied him for a moment, then wrote, "Friends, yes. Though I hope," she paused, erasing what she'd begun to write, then more simply, "I'm glad we're friends." The next day, Vaughn arranged with Porter to take some personal time. He arrived at the millinery shop mid-morning with tools and supplies loaded on his pack horse. Pearl greeted him with a smile that warmed him more thoroughly than any summer sun. As he worked sealing drafts around windows, repairing loose boards, checking the integrity of the stove pipe, Pearl kept the shop running below. Occasionally she would bring him tea or check his progress, her eyes conveying gratitude and something else he dared not name. By late afternoon, he had transformed her living quarters. The small stove drew properly, the windows were sealed against drafts, and the worst gaps in the floorboards and walls had been patched. "Should be much more comfortable now," he told her as she surveyed his work. "You'll still want to hang heavy curtains over the windows at night and keep the stove fed, but it won't be like trying to heat the whole outdoors anymore." Pearl's expression was luminous with appreciation. She wrote on her slate, "I don't know how to thank you properly." "No need," Vaughn assured her. Just knowing you'll be warm this winter is thanks enough." She seemed to make a decision then. Setting down her slate, she stepped closer and rose on tiptoe to place a soft kiss on his cheek. The gentle touch of her lips sent a current through him more powerful than lightning. When she stepped back, her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes were steady, watching his reaction. "Pearl," he said, her name almost a whisper. She picked up her slate and wrote, "Would you stay for dinner? I've prepared a stew." It was an invitation to more than a meal, and they both knew it. A step toward something neither had planned but both had begun to want. "I'd like that very much," Vaughn answered. That evening, dining at her small table by lamplight, conversation flowing through words and written notes, Vaughn realized he was crossing a threshold he'd avoided for years. The careful distance he maintained from others, his protection against loss and pain, was dissolving in the face of Pearl's silent eloquence. As winter descended on Willow Creek, Vaughn found himself drawn to the millinery shop with increasing frequency. The bitter cold and heavy snow that blanketed the territory made travel between the ranch and town more difficult, but he made the journey whenever duties and weather permitted. December brought Christmas preparations to Willow Creek. The millinery shop thrived as townswomen sought accessories for holiday gatherings. Pearl worked long hours to meet the demand, creating custom pieces and adorning her window display with festive ribbons and ornaments. Vaughn worried about her overworking herself, especially when he noticed the shadows beneath her eyes during his visits. On impulse, he brought her a gift, a beautifully crafted wooden box lined with velvet, perfect for storing the special pins and small tools she used in her millinery work. "Just something practical," he explained awkwardly when she opened it. "Noticed your tools were scattered on your workbench." Pearl's eyes shimmered with emotion as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood. She wrote, "It's beautiful, Vaughn. Did you make this?" He nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Been working on it at night, wanted to give you something useful." She set down her slate and stepped close to him, wrapping her arms around his waist in a warm embrace. Vaughn hesitated only briefly before returning the hug, drawing her closer. They stood that way for a long moment, her head resting against his chest, his cheek against her hair. When she finally stepped back, she wrote, "That is the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." Something shifted between them that day, a recognition that what they shared had grown beyond friendship. Neither put it into words, but it lived in the lingering glances, the way their hands would brush when walking side by side, the comfortable silences that needed no filling. As Christmas approached, Vaughn found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. His life had been lived day to day, season to season, with no particular destination in mind. Now, unbidden, he found himself imagining a different path, one with Pearl beside him. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Opening himself to such possibilities meant risking the very pain he'd spent years avoiding. Yet the alternative, returning to his solitary existence, seemed suddenly unthinkable. On Christmas Eve, Willow Creek gathered for a community celebration at the church. Pearl had closed the shop early to attend, and Vaughn had ridden through increasing snowfall to join her. They sat side by side in a pew near the back, listening to carols and scripture readings by lamplight. In the warm glow of the church, with Pearl's hand resting lightly in his, Vaughn felt a peace he hadn't known since childhood. The preacher spoke of hope and new beginnings, words that resonated deeply. After the service, they walked through the snowy street toward the millinery shop. The snowfall had intensified, muffling sounds and transforming the town into a white wonderland. Their footprints left parallel tracks in the fresh snow, side by side. At her door, Pearl turned to face him. Snowflakes caught in her honey blonde hair and on her eyelashes. She looked ethereal in the moonlight that penetrated the clouds. "Merry Christmas, Pearl," Vaughn said softly. She smiled and reached for the slate she kept in her coat pocket. On it she wrote, "I have a gift for you." "You didn't need to," he began, but she placed a finger to his lips, silencing him. From her other pocket, she withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon. Vaughn accepted it, carefully unwrapping it to reveal a finely crafted leather wallet, the initials VX tooled into the surface. "It's perfect," he said, genuinely touched. "Thank you." Pearl wrote, "Look inside." Opening the wallet, Vaughn found a small daguerreotype, a portrait of Pearl, smiling gently at the camera. "When did you?" he asked, surprised. She wrote, "The traveling photographer who visited last month. I wanted you to have something to remember me by when you're at the ranch." "As if I could forget you," he said, the words coming straight from his heart. Their eyes met in the snowy darkness. Vaughn knew he stood at another threshold, one even more significant than before. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and gently pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft, questioning at first, then deepening as Pearl responded. Her arms circled his neck as he drew her closer, the connection between them transcending words or silence. When they finally parted, both breathless, Pearl's eyes were shining. She took up her slate and wrote, "I think I'm falling in love with you, Vaughn Xander." The words both thrilled and terrified him. For so long, he had believed that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, that attachment only led to pain. But standing here with Pearl in the falling snow, those fears seemed distant and hollow compared to the reality of her presence. "I know I'm falling in love with you," he answered, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "Have been since that day by the creek when you trusted me with your story." Her smile was radiant. She wrote, "Stay tonight. The snow is getting worse." The invitation carried weight beyond the practical concern about weather. Vaughn knew they stood at the edge of something that would change both their lives irrevocably. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Pearl nodded, her eyes certain and clear. That night, as the blizzard raged outside, they created a sanctuary of warmth within. Their coming together was tender and reverent, a physical expression of the connection that had been building between them for months. In Pearl's silent passion, Vaughn found an eloquence more profound than any words could convey. Afterward, holding her close as she slept against his chest, Vaughn watched snowflakes swirl past the window. For the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to imagine a future filled with something other than mere survival, a future with love, with purpose, with Pearl. But as dawn approached, doubt crept in. What did he truly have to offer her? A cowhand's meager wages, a life of hardship on the frontier. Pearl deserved better, security, comfort, a man who could provide for her properly, not a drifter who had spent his life avoiding connections. By morning, as Pearl stirred beside him, Vaughn had convinced himself that the honorable path was to step back, to give her the chance to find someone more worthy of her trust and love. "Morning," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face when her eyes fluttered open. She smiled sleepily and reached for her slate on the bedside table. She wrote, "Best Christmas morning ever." Her simple joy pierced his heart. How could he voice his doubts now in the face of such contentment? Instead, he kissed her forehead and said, "I should check on my horse. The storm's past." Pearl's expression clouded slightly, sensing the shift in his mood. She wrote, "Is everything all right?" "Of course," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just ranch responsibilities. Porter will be expecting me back." She studied him for a moment longer, then wrote, "When will I see you again?" "Soon," he promised, already knowing he would need to create distance. For her sake, he told himself, because she deserved better than what he could offer. As he dressed and prepared to leave, Vaughn felt the walls he'd carefully constructed around his heart beginning to rebuild themselves. It was familiar territory, safer, more controlled. Pearl walked him to the door, wrapped in her robe. She wrote, "Be careful on the trails, the snow will have drifted." "I will," he assured her. He kissed her once more, trying not to think of it as goodbye. "Merry Christmas, Pearl." As he rode away from town, the bitter cold seemed to match the chill settling over his heart. He had allowed himself to dream, to imagine possibilities beyond solitude, but in the harsh light of morning, those dreams seemed like dangerous illusions. Better to retreat now, he reasoned, before they both became too invested. Before she realized his inadequacies, before he failed her, as he feared he inevitably would, back at the Circle M, Vaughn threw himself into work with renewed intensity. January brought bitter cold and demanding ranch tasks that provided convenient excuses to avoid trips to town. When Porter asked if he would deliver documents to the bank in Willow Creek, Vaughn suggested sending another hand instead. "Thought you'd be eager for a trip to town," Porter remarked, studying Vaughn with knowing eyes, "given your interest in a certain milliner." "Got plenty to do here," Vaughn replied, avoiding his boss's gaze. Porter shook his head. "Son, I've watched you circle back into that shell of yours these past weeks. Don't know what happened between you and Miss Zachary, but running from it won't solve anything." "Nothing happened," Vaughn insisted. Just realize some things aren't meant to be. Porter said skeptically. Well, suit yourself, but I've seen how you light up around that young woman. Shame to extinguish that kind of spark out of fear. It's not fear, Vaughn protested. It's a practicality. Porter snorted. Call it what you will. Just remember, a man can survive alone, but he can't truly live that way. The words haunted Vaughn in the days that followed. He tried to focus on work, on the rhythm of ranch life that had sustained him for years. But memories of Pearl intruded constantly, her smile, her gentle touch, the eloquence of her expressions that needed no voice. He wondered how she was faring, if the shop was busy, if she was staying warm enough in the winter cold. Several times he found himself saddling his horse with the intention of riding to town, only to change his mind at the last moment. One evening in late January, as Vaughn sat alone in the bunkhouse mending tack, Elijah entered, stamping snow from his boots. Mail came through, the older cowhand announced, tossing an envelope onto Vaughn's bunk. For you. Vaughn stared at the envelope, immediately recognizing Pearl's neat handwriting. His heart raced as he picked it up, torn between eagerness and dread. Aren't you going to open it? Elijah prodded when Vaughn continued to stare at the envelope. Later, Vaughn muttered, tucking it into his shirt pocket, when there's privacy. Elijah shook his head. You're a fool, Xander. That woman is the best thing that's happened to you in years, and you're hiding from her like she's carrying smallpox. You don't understand, Vaughn began. Oh, I understand plenty, Elijah interrupted. You're scared of caring too much, scared of losing her like you lost your folks. But here's the truth, son, we all lose the people we love eventually. That's life. The only real choice is whether to love them while we can or die a little each day we don't. The old cowhand's words struck with uncomfortable precision. Vaughn said nothing, but later, alone in the stables, he carefully opened Pearl's letter. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in her neat handwriting. Dear Vaughn, 3 weeks have passed since Christmas, since the night that meant everything to me. 3 weeks of silence that speak volumes about your regrets. I understand retreat, I understand fear. I have lived in both since the day my voice abandoned me. What I don't understand is why you would show me a glimpse of what connection could be, only to withdraw it. Was I merely convenient? A curiosity, the silent woman whose brokenness intrigued you temporarily. Perhaps I imagined more between us than existed. If so, I apologize for my presumption. But if there was truth in your touch, in your words, in the way you held me that night, then your absence now is cruelty disguised as kindness. I have survived betrayal before. I will survive this too. But I deserved more than disappearance without explanation. If you decide I am worth the risk of caring, you know where to find me. If not, please have the courage to tell me so directly. With a heart that still hopes. Pearl. The letter fell from Vaughn's trembling hands. Each word was a mirror reflecting the cowardice of his actions. He had done exactly what Pearl's father had done, made choices that affected her profoundly without respecting her enough to include her in the decision. Shame washed over him, followed by the sickening realization that he might have already lost her, not to some external danger as he had always feared, but to his own self-protective instincts. Dawn was still hours away, but Vaughn couldn't wait. He saddled his horse and rode through the moonlit snow toward Willow Creek, Pearl's letter tucked safely in his pocket. The bitter cold bit at his face and hands, but he barely noticed, focused only on reaching her, on making right what he had so terribly damaged. The town was silent and still when he arrived, most windows dark except for the occasional lamp. The millinery shop was similarly dark, but a faint light glowed in the upstairs window, Pearl's living quarters. Vaughn hesitated beneath that window. What right did he have to disturb her at this hour? To expect her forgiveness after weeks of silence, but the alternative, leaving without speaking his heart, seemed unthinkable now. He gathered a few small pebbles and gently tossed them at the window. After the third attempt, the curtain moved aside and Pearl's face appeared, looking down in surprise. Moments later, she opened the shop door, wrapped in a heavy shawl over her nightdress. Her expression was guarded, uncertain. Pearl, Vaughn said, removing his hat. I'm sorry for the hour, I read your letter. She nodded slightly but made no move to invite him in. Her slate was not in her hands. Without it, she could only watch and wait. I've been a coward, he continued. Worse than that, I've been selfish and cruel, justifying it as concern for your welfare. The truth is, I was protecting myself, not you." He took a deep breath. "I convinced myself you deserved better than what I could offer. But what I really feared was how much I had come to need you." Pearl's expression softened slightly, but she remained in the doorway, listening. "All my life, I've believed that caring too deeply was dangerous, that it made you vulnerable to the worst kind of pain. When my parents died, I learned early that attachment leads to loss, so I built walls, kept moving, never stayed close enough to anyone to really feel their absence if they left." Vaughn stepped closer. "It worked until you. Until I realized that not caring, that's not safety, it's just a slower kind of death." He reached into his pocket and withdrew her letter. "Everything you wrote was right. You deserved an explanation, not disappearance. You deserved honesty." He met her eyes directly. "The truth is, I love you, Pearl. I love your courage, your resilience, the way you've built a life here despite everything that happened before. I love how you listen, how you see me, really see me, when most people just look past." Pearl's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her expression remained cautious. "I don't know if you can forgive me," Vaughn continued. "I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't, but I needed you to know that Christmas wasn't a mistake for me. It was the most real thing I've ever experienced. I just didn't have the courage to accept what it meant, that for the first time in my life, I was afraid of losing something because it mattered so damn much." Pearl studied him for a long moment. Then she held up one finger, "Wait," and disappeared inside the shop. When she returned, she had her slate and chalk. She wrote quickly, "Do you know what the worst part was? Not that you left, not even that you stayed away. It was believing that I had somehow misunderstood everything between us. That I had imagined a connection that wasn't real." "It was real," Vaughn assured her. "Is real, I just got scared of how real it is." She erased the slate and wrote again, "Fear I understand, abandonment I cannot accept. If you love me, if you want any future with me, you must promise never to disappear like that again. Whatever fears come, whatever doubts arise, we face them together or not at all." "I promise," Vaughn said without hesitation. "No more running, no more hiding. Whatever comes, we face it together." Pearl's expression softened further. She wrote, "It's freezing out here, come inside." In the warmth of her small living quarters, they talked until dawn, Vaughn speaking aloud, Pearl writing on her slate. They discussed fears and hopes, past wounds and future possibilities. With each exchange, the distance between them narrowed, trust cautiously rebuilding. As pale morning light began to filter through the windows, Pearl wrote, "I love you too, Vaughn, despite everything, perhaps because of everything. You see me as whole when others see only what's missing." Vaughn took her hands in his. "There's nothing missing about you, Pearl. You communicate more clearly than anyone I've ever known." She smiled at this, then wrote, "What happens now?" It was the question Vaughn had been considering throughout the night. "Now," he said, "I'd like to court you properly. No more hiding, no more pretending this is less than what it is. And someday, if you'll have me, I'd like to build a life with you." Pearl's eyes shone with happiness. She wrote, "I would like that very much." As spring approached, Willow Creek began to emerge from winter's grip. The snow receded, revealing muddy streets and the first tentative shoots of green. The millinery shop thrived under Pearl's skilled management, attracting customers from surrounding ranches and even neighboring towns. Vaughn kept his promise, visiting whenever his duties at the Circle M allowed. Their courtship became a subject of approving gossip in town, the silent milliner and the formerly reclusive Cowboy, whose transformation was noted by all who knew him. The ghost, as he had once been called, had become solid and present, engaged with the community in ways he'd avoided for years. Their love flourished in the warming days. Vaughn began teaching Pearl to ride, delighting in her quick learning and natural grace in the saddle. They explored the countryside together on Sundays, picnicking in meadows dotted with wildflowers. In the evenings, they would sit on the bench outside her shop, planning and dreaming. Vaughn had begun saving money, squirreling away a portion of his wages with purpose. He had spoken to Porter about purchasing a small parcel of land adjacent to the Circle M, enough for a modest house and perhaps some animals of their own. "Been wondering when you'd get around to thinking of your future," Porter had commented approvingly. "That piece would suit you fine. Good water, decent grazing, not too far from town for Miss Zachary's business." The idea of building something permanent, a home, a life with Pearl, filled Vaughn with anticipation rather than the anxiety he might once have felt. The walls he had built around his heart had not just cracked but transformed, becoming instead the foundation for something new and stronger. One warm evening in late April, as they walked along the creek that had witnessed so many of their conversations, Vaughn decided the moment had come. He had carried his mother's ring, the only valuable she had left behind, in his pocket for weeks, waiting for the right time. They paused at a bend in the creek, where willows dipped their new green leaves toward the water. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, reflecting in the flowing water. "Pearl," Vaughn said, taking her hands in his, "these past months have been the happiest of my life. You've shown me what it means to truly live, not just survive." Pearl smiled, her blue eyes soft with affection. "I've spent most of my life avoiding attachments, convinced that caring too much was dangerous," he continued. "But loving you has taught me that the greater risk is never loving at all." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew the small velvet pouch containing his mother's ring. Pearl's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing the simple gold band with its small, perfect diamond. "This was my mother's," Vaughn explained. "The only thing of value she left behind. She told me once to give it only to a woman who made me believe in forever." He took a deep breath and dropped to one knee. "Pearl Zachary, I love you more than I ever thought possible. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Pearl's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. For a long moment she stood perfectly still, emotion overwhelming her. Then, to Vaughn's astonishment, she spoke, her voice rough and barely above a whisper from disuse, but unmistakably clear. "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them, miraculous and profound. Vaughn stared at her in wonder, hardly believing what he had heard. Pearl looked equally shocked. She touched her throat, tears streaming down her face now. Again she whispered, "Yes, Vaughn, yes." "You spoke," he said, rising to his feet, still holding the ring. "Pearl, you spoke." She nodded, overwhelmed. When she tried to say more, the words caught in her throat, not yet ready to flow freely after months of silence. Instead, she reached for her slate and wrote, "My voice, it came back for you, for this moment." Vaughn gathered her into his arms, holding her close as emotion swept through both of them. "It doesn't matter if you speak or not," he assured her. "I love you either way, but hearing you say yes," he pulled back to look into her eyes, "that's a gift I'll treasure forever." With hands that trembled slightly, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. "My mother would have loved you," he said softly. "She always said the strongest people were those who could remain gentle despite life's hardships." Pearl touched the ring reverently, then wrote on her slate, "I will try to speak more. The doctor in Philadelphia said it might return gradually if the cause of the blockage was resolved." "And has it been?" Vaughn asked. "Resolved?" She nodded, then wrote, "With you I feel safe, believed. The fear that silenced me has lost its power." She paused, then added, "It may take time for my voice to return completely, but it has begun." "We have all the time in the world," Vaughn assured her, kissing her gently. "And whether you speak with your voice or your slate or just your expressions, I'll always hear you." The news of their engagement spread quickly through Willow Creek. The community embraced the romance of their story, the silent milliner who found her voice at the moment of proposal, the reclusive cowboy transformed by love. Wedding preparations began in earnest, with a date set for early June. Pearl's voice returned gradually as the doctor had predicted, at first just whispered words shared only with Vaughn. Then short sentences, her vocal cords strengthening with use. By their wedding day, she could speak for brief periods, though she still carried her slate for times when words failed or her voice tired. The ceremony took place in the small church, filled to capacity with townspeople and ranch hands. Pearl wore a gown of ivory silk she had designed herself, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Vaughn, in a new suit that felt stiff but proper, watched in awe as she walked toward him on Mr. Bishop's arm. When the time came for their vows, Pearl handed her bouquet to Mrs. Bishop and took Vaughn's hands in hers. Looking directly into his eyes, she spoke clearly enough for all to hear. "I, Pearl, take you, Vaughn, to be my husband. I promise to stand beside you through all of life's joys and hardships." You saw me when I was invisible, heard me when I was silent, and loved me when I thought myself unlovable. With you, I found not just my voice but my home." Her voice faltered slightly toward the end, emotion making it difficult to continue. She squeezed Vaughn's hands, conveying what words could not fully express. Vaughn's own vows came from the depths of his transformed heart. "I, Vaughn, take you, Pearl, to be my wife. I promise to listen always, to trust in our bond when fear arises, and to remember daily what you have taught me, that true strength comes not from isolation but from the courage to love completely. You broke through walls I thought impenetrable, bringing light to places long dark. With you, I am finally whole." As they exchanged rings and were pronounced husband and wife, Vaughn felt the last of his old defenses dissolve. The path ahead would hold challenges, as any frontier life did, but they would face them together, two people who had found in each other the healing they could not find alone. Their new home, a small but sturdy cabin built on the land Vaughn had purchased near the Circle M, awaited them. Pearl would maintain the millinery shop in town, riding in most days while Vaughn continued his work at the ranch. It was an arrangement that suited them both, independence alongside commitment, individual pursuits within a shared life. Later that evening, as they stood on the porch of their new home watching the sun set over the mountains, Pearl rested her head against Vaughn's shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. She nodded, then said softly, "More than I ever imagined possible." "Even with all the uncertainties of frontier life?" he asked, thinking of the challenges they would inevitably face: harsh winters, the isolation of their remote location, the economic vagaries of both ranching and commerce. Pearl smiled. "Those aren't the real uncertainties," she said. "The real risk in life is never knowing if you're truly seen, truly heard, truly loved." She turned to face him, placing her hand on his cheek. "And in that, with you, I have absolute certainty." Vaughn covered her hand with his own. "As do I." As darkness settled over the Montana landscape, they entered their home together, two souls who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to believe in it despite all that life had taught them about loss and pain. The silent cowboy and the voiceless milliner had both found the words they needed most, spoken not just with voices, but with choices, with presence, with the daily decision to remain open despite the risk. In the years that followed, as their family grew and their roots deepened in the community, that certainty never wavered. The frontier remained challenging, but they faced each trial together, stronger for having overcome the greatest obstacle of all: the fear that had once kept them isolated in their separate silences. Their love story became something of a legend in Willow Creek: how a cowboy's patient devotion had restored a woman's voice, how a woman's silent courage had taught a recluse to truly live. But for Vaughn and Pearl, the real miracle was simpler. In a harsh and unpredictable world, they had found their way to each other, creating a sanctuary of understanding that neither could have built alone.